Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
H.R. 1192, the Puerto Rico Recovery Accuracy Disclosures Act, or PRADA, is common sense legislation that would promote greater transparency and integrity with respect to the ongoing financial reorganization of Puerto Rico. This will be the third time in just over 2 years that the House will vote on this legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, I think the third time will be the charm. In response to dire fiscal issues facing Puerto Rico, at the time, Congress passed the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA, in 2016. That legislation established the Financial Oversight and Management Board with control over Puerto Rico's budget, laws, financial plans, and regulations, and the authority to retain professionals to assist the board in executing its responsibilities. Although largely patterned on Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code, PROMESA did not incorporate all the facets of Chapter 11 and other relevant provisions of the Code. Importantly, this includes the Code's mandatory disclosure requirements regarding actual or potential conflicts of interest that professional persons seeking to be retained in a bankruptcy case must make to the court prior to their retention. This bill would close that loophole by conditioning the compensation of professional persons retained under PROMESA under certain disclosures similar to those required under the Bankruptcy Code. Additionally, the bill would require the United States trustee to review these disclosures and to submit comments in response to the court. And it also authorizes the United States trustee to object to compensation requested by professionals. And finally, H.R. 1192 would allow courts to deny compensation for services and reimbursement of expenses if the professional person did not comply with the disclosure requirement, was not a disinterested person, or represented or held an interest adverse to the bankruptcy case. Common sense. The House passed H.R. 1192 last February, and the Senate passed an amended version of the Act last December. The Senate amendments streamline PRADA's reporting requirements, strengthen the incentives for good faith compliance, and clarify other provisions of the Act. Now Puerto Rico's restructuring is drawing to a close, which makes passage of this legislation especially urgent. I thank Representative Velázquez for her leadership in championing this bill and for her relentless dedication to ensuring that the people of Puerto Rico receive fair, efficient, and transparent restructuring processes they deserve. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, which was passed out of the House last year and the year before by unanimous votes, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania reserves her time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Senate amendment to H.R. 1192, the Puerto Rico Recovery Accuracy and Disclosures Act of 2021. In 2016, Puerto Rico was experiencing severe financial pressure from significant debt and related obligations. In response to Puerto Rico's financial distress, Congress enacted the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act of 2016. That 2016 law created a bankruptcy process for Puerto Rico. Like existing bankruptcy law, in 2016, the law permitted certain professionals working on Puerto Rico's bankruptcy, like lawyers and accountants, to apply to get paid for their services pending judicial approval. But the 2016 law lacks certain disclosure requirements for these professionals that would typically apply to restructuring professionals in other bankruptcy cases. The gap in the 2016 law created the potential for undisclosed conflicts of interest for professionals involved in Puerto Rico's bankruptcy. This bill fills the gap by mandating the necessary disclosure requirements. The bill also establishes a process for overseeing and policing disclosures that bankruptcy professionals make. H.R. 1192 passed the House unanimously in February of 2021. In December, the Senate passed H.R. 1192 with a few minor amendments to improve the bill's administrative abilities. The amendments also enhance the incentives for professionals to make significant efforts to comply with the new disclosure requirements. H.R. 1192 will serve important goals and interests, including the interests of creditors and taxpayers, and Puerto Rico itself. I encourage my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Wisconsin reserves the balance of his time. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania reserves. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would now, I'm honored to yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Puerto Rico, Ms. González-Colón.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the approval in the House of the Senate amendments to H.R. 1192, the Puerto Rico Recovery, Accuracy, and Disclosures Act. I joined Representative Velázquez to promote this bipartisan and common sense bill to help ensure the restructuring process under PROMESA serves Puerto Rico's interest. Actually, just this week, the plan of the debt was approved by the federal court. So this is perfect timing to approve this bill today. Thought it required some technical corrections, it is satisfying to see this bill has already achieved passage in both chambers. I wish for my colleague, Congressman Velázquez, to be fully recovered in time to see it become law. The intent of this legislation remains the same, and this bill will require any person or firm hired as a legal, financial, or technical staff or consultants for the Financial Oversight Board in the court cases for the restructuring of the Puerto Rico's debt to submit verified disclosures of all connections with debtors, creditors, or other interested parties in the process before being compensated. Our intention is not to exclude people with experience in Puerto Rico's financial transactions from being resources in the restructuring process, but it is essential that their connection to any parties interested in those transactions be known. Conflict of interest or the appearance of conflict of interest can be best avoided if there is accountability and transparency. Anyone working to inform the board's decision or representing it before the court needs to be committed to defending the interests of the people of Puerto Rico first, in accordance with the law and justice. Lack of transparency creates a lack of trust, and this bill will work towards avoiding that by making these disclosures a legal mandate rather than the board's own discretion. Our goal is to reach the day we no longer need the provisions of PROMESA and the Oversight Board, but until that happens, this instrument must be accountable and transparent. I ask my colleagues to support the passage of the Senate amendments to H.R. 1192, the Puerto Rico Recovery, Accuracy, and Disclosures Act, and I thank you and I yield back.
Gentleman from Wisconsin reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, we have no further speakers, so we would be prepared to close.
Gentleman from Wisconsin reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we too have no further speakers, and I am prepared to close. We'll defer to the gentleman.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
I would just like to reiterate that I think there's a lot of support in the chamber, and I'd support it as well, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, in closing, H.R. 1192 closes a loophole under current law by establishing disclosure requirements regarding actual or potential conflicts of interest into the bankruptcy process under PROMESA. In doing so, this legislation promotes transparency and accountability in the Puerto Rico restructuring process. I thank my colleague, Representative Velázquez from New York, the author of the bill, for her leadership on this issue, and I strongly urge my colleagues to support this common sense measure. Mr. Speaker, with that, I yield back.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and concur in the Senate amendment to H.R. 1192? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the Senate amendment is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.